Welcome, everyone. Today, we have another session of invited speakers as part of our course, Asking Those Who Feel It, Local and Indigenous Knowledge on Climate Change. This course is largely led by Jakob Steiner from the University of Graz and the Himalayan University Consortium. And I also co-teach. My name is Inka Koch. I am from Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen. And we offer courses in the transdisciplinary course program to students from all disciplines. In this course today, we are investigating how local and indigenous knowledge is important for tackling the climatic crisis, and also how it can be included better in scientific assessments. And also, with regard to the lecture today, or the talk with my experts today, we would like to see how it can be incorporated better in practice on the ground. So I would like to introduce Noelia and Gabriela, and their surnames is Rojas Ortiz, and I probably have a very strong German accent pronouncing this. Noelia and Gabriela both have indigenous descent, and they are also considering themselves as indigenous knowledge holders, but they will speak exactly about what that means to them. Their parents are from the highlands in Peru. Their dad is from Cerro de Pasco, and their mom is from Arequipa. And they are both living in Lima, but also going back to Arequipa regularly. And their family moved to the Lima, the capital, in the 80s, but they kept very strong ties to their communities in the highlands. So Gabriela is currently a sanitation engineer, sanitation and water engineer, and she works at the intersection of water management and health. And in her past, she studied sanitation engineering, and she currently works a lot with water distribution and waste management and fire protection systems. And Noelia is currently a master student at the University of Tübingen for cultures of the Global South. And her work focuses on literature and migration. Her background is in history, and she also studied national security and development and did an exchange to Florida on public management. And she is a language teacher, which we are extremely fortunate to have her here today because she can translate from what her sister will say later. So, Noelia, we are very excited to have you here, and I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Hello, everybody. I hope everybody is ready. Please hold onto your notepads. Try not to blink. If you blink, you'll miss it. We are going to try to summarize 1,000 years of indigenous knowledge. I am, in fact, a person of indigenous descent, but I am not really active inside a community of indigenous people. That would be my father. Well, I think we should start from the beginning, but not so far back as Adam, the apple, and the snake. That's a little bit too far. So when I think of Peru, I usually like to think of the number 3. So it is very simple, and you can even do it with your fingers, right? So 1, 2, 3, right? So think about Peru and how visual it is, because Peru is beautiful, as in many countries that you are going to travel one day, or perhaps are lucky to read about. Peru, it's all about the number 3. In here, you can see the volcano Misty. It is one of the 3 most popular volcanoes in Arequipa, where my mother is from. I am Peruvian, but I am also from the capital city in Lima, but I am also from Arequipa. We are the most southern of the southern people that can ever exist. We are from the global south, we are from South America, and we are from the southern side of Peru. So in here, we have a view of the Misty volcano, and that is one of the most important volcanoes in Arequipa, which are also three, actually. So you have the Misty, the Chachani, and the Picchu Picchu. Now, you don't need to be a scholar or an expert in Quechua, one of the most popular indigenous languages in Peru, but it can really save your life. And that is a commentary on how indigenous knowledge is not a thing from the past, but is very much alive and kicking. It is a thing of the present. It's also the path to the future. Indigenous knowledge sometimes is seen as very ancestral or very old, but it's actually quite modern. And during this presentation, you're going to see how modern it is and how actually these three things, present, past, and future, are actually not linear for many indigenous cultures, but a cycle. And so, in this way, the past paves the way to the future. We were talking about the three volcanoes, right? The Misty, the Chachani, and the Picchu Picchu. So you have the Misty, that means the great lord. You have the Chachani, which means the brave one. And you have the Picchu Picchu, that means the summit. You may have heard of the Machu Picchu, right? So there you go. You already understand a little bit of Quechua, right? Machu means old. So if Picchu Picchu means the summit, the Machu Picchu means the old summit. And that's how you can make sense of the geography of the area where you are. Because indigenous knowledge holders can inform you in ways that can be life-saving. You may have heard of rituals that are performed before tourists or even scientists need to perform before going into these protected areas. They are, in a way, a very interesting ritual to pay respects to the land you are setting your foot on, but also it is a way of risk management, you see. So think about it in this way. A ritual usually takes place early in the morning. And while you are practicing this ritual, indigenous knowledge holders are also observing the sky. And after a few hours, once the ritual is performed, you know if the sky or if the weather is going to turn against you. If you see the clouds turning gray, you know that it is a bad omen and the person might be at risk. So the mountain or the volcano or the area where you are has not given you permission. Of course, this is said in magical words, right? But it's really only the weather forecast. And that is very modern. Everybody checks the weather forecast before going on a hike or on an adventure, right? So it is very modern and very current. Now, I was talking about the three volcanoes, but I kind of lie. Those three are the most popular, but in Arequipa, there are actually seven. And by knowing the names and what they mean, you can inform yourself again in life-saving strategies. One of these seven volcanoes is called the Sabancaya. It means fire tongue. So you had the Chachani, the brave one, the Picchu Picchu, the summit, Misty, the great lord, and Sabancaya, the fire tongue. You can guess which one is active. There you go, another life-saving strategy. Now, this is just shameless promotion for Arequipa because I love this place and it is my mother's hometown. I was talking about the number 3. This is the Peruvian coat of arms. You can see this in plenty of tourist promotion ads, and they usually represent the vicuña, the quina tree, and the cornucopia. Now, it is important to remember that the quina tree was essential for Europe at a time where the bark of this tree was used to cure malaria, before vaccines and medicine, modern medicine for this existed. Now, but something a little bit sinister about this as well is that it also represents the three main activities for economic extractivism in the Andes. So that means that these three things that we are so proud of have also been cause of a lot of inequality and exploitation. Until now, we have, as you can see, wildlife that's being exploited and it's endangered. We have quina tree that is also an endangered species, among others. And unfortunately, mining since the colonial times. The minas of Potosi have represented the most cruel aspects of colonization. And until now, it's also a driver of migration, human trafficking, and even organ harvesting. Let's move on. Another number 3. We have 3 regions. Actually, there are more. And for those of you who are more interested in the specifics, there are up to 9 with more information and details about what temperatures and how the weather changes on each. But for the sake of practicality at school, we always compact them in 3 big regions. So you have the coast that is near the Pacific Ocean, that is the yellow part. Then you have the brown part, that is the highlands, where my family is from, and one of the areas with the highest concentration of people of indigenous descent. And then you have the jungle, which is the biggest, but at the same time, not the most populated, even though it also has some concentration of people of indigenous descent. They have their own culture and they are very particular about the ways they practice and preserve their rituals. So in here, you can see 2 maps in which a survey from the National Institute of Statistics and Informatics gathered information about some people that self-identified as being of indigenous descent or originary from the Andes, that is in brown, and people of indigenous descent in the jungle. We have another number 3 in here. Peru has also 3 big cities with the highest concentration of people of indigenous descent. Those also happen to be some of the biggest cities when it comes to space and territory. And another number 3, Peru happens to be the 3rd biggest country in South America. First Brazil, second Argentina, and 3rd is Peru. So another number 3. Another number 3 when it comes to language. There are 3 big groups which also share their own languages. There are many languages in Peru. There are about 50 to 55 languages that have been recorded. There are more that we haven't been able to register formally, but the biggest groups are the Quichuas, the Aymaras, and the Ashaninkas. The Quichuas and the Aymaras are native to the south, but in the 60s, there was some political issues and instability in the highlands, which drove people from the highlands to the city, which is why the capital city, Lima, is also one of the cities with the highest concentrations, as you can see, with people of indigenous descent. Unlike Ashaninkas, who stayed in nearby areas of their places of origin. Ashaninkas are mostly in the jungle. Now, we can observe as well that by 2017, there were around 6 million people indigenous or native to the Andes. But something interesting about this is that in South America, both Peru and Bolivia are countries that share such a rich history together with high concentration of indigenous people that by now those people themselves don't really go about life calling themselves indigenous. It is something like a person from France and a person from Germany saying that they are from Europe. It might come into a conversation, but it is more common that they themselves call themselves German and French, right? So that has to do also with the aspect of identity and locality. Now, let's observe a little bit of numbers, because today everybody is really interested in this session about what is the connection between the indigenous people and the indigenous knowledge holders, and how climate change comes into the equation. Now, climate change, it is a driver of migration, because as you can see, many of these communities and many of the people of indigenous descent used to be settled in their areas of origin, where they were able to domesticate animals, domesticate and experiment on plants long enough to make them hardy and to survive different natural disasters. The problem is that nowadays those disasters are not natural anymore, but they are man-made. So, along with political instability, those people are driven out of the lands into cities where there is no infrastructure that can welcome them. As a result, this driver of migration spreads into different branches of inequality. One of them is low scholarity. Out of 6 million indigenous people or native to the Andes, only 40% has secondary education. Many of them, as much as almost 10%, has no education at all. This also stems to public services and how everyday life can be lived without dignity. And I'm talking about things such as access to water, access to a toilet, and all the social issues and health issues that can stem from the lack of these everyday basic services, right? In urban areas where there is the highest concentration of people of indigenous descent, there is 83% of people who have access to water. But I would like you to look not just what is here, but what is not. So 83% of people in urban areas have access to water through the public network. What happened to the other 12%? In rural areas, half the people have access to it. What happened to the other half? And it is a huge number, right? So now suddenly, looking at these numbers as in negative from a picture, comes with a horrifying reality. Now, this is from a report from 2017. And now we have the graphic, which is from 2023. You can also see these areas, as you have familiarized yourself a little bit with our map, the levels of poverty, the biggest cities, and also the cities with highest concentration of people of indigenous descent happen to be the ones with the highest levels of poverty. Now, it is important for us to talk about how we can make a change and how we can remember how this is not really about the past. Remember that we talked about temporalities, present, past, and future, right? Now, something interesting about the past that is very current is rituals. And let's circle back to that. I told you about rituals performed nowadays to make the future happen, to make science happen. And that's where Lastuntay comes into play. Lastuntay is one of the rivers where studies are made, and it sits really close to the Huaytapallana mountain. You see, Peruvian people have a really close relationship to the mountains. We owe our life to it. It is the cause of our tribulations, but also what made life possible. Our lore is based on how mountains were made and how food was available because of it. And Lastuntay is one of such historic yet legendary rivers. Now, why is Lastuntay so important? This is very German, yet very Peruvian. Now, the German Aerospace Center has made some studies in Peru to ensure that the water quality near Lastuntay doesn't decrease. With economic extractivist policies, with pollution and with crop rotation meant to exploit the land rather than protect it, many of these rivers and wetlands have been hurt. So as a result, there have been international efforts to protect these areas. The water quality needs to be measured. People need to go on the field. And before going in the field, they need to perform rituals. As we talked about before, risk management. We have scientists coming all the way from Europe to Peru, and we want to make sure that they go back home in one piece. So rituals must be performed to ensure their safety. We talked about 3 main languages as well as 3 main people of indigenous descent, right? So the Quechua, the Aymara, and the Ashaninka. Now let's talk about a little bit languages in here. Almost half the population speaks Spanish. There is a big majority that speaks Quechua, and there's a smaller yet very important population that speaks Aymara. But I would like to, again, talk about for those who are not really here and who fall off the edges of our service and our statistics. And I would like to make an honorable mention to other indigenous languages. One of them is Shipibo Conibo. I would like you to observe this embroidery in here. It might look familiar, it might look completely foreign. Think about yourself waking up in the morning. When you are between being half asleep and half awake, and then you're rubbing your eyes, and then you see these visions, right, like little dots. It is something very interesting to observe because it has to do with the world of dreams. So let me introduce you to the Shipibo Conibo people. This is Lucia Sumaeta. She is a midwife, and she is also an artist from the jungle. She is from Ucayali, from a community called San Francisco de Asís. She does embroidery as well as other type of Shipibo Conibo art. And remember I talked about dreams. Something interesting about the Shipibo and Conibo people is that they believe that what they make in this world are a product of their dreams. And many of this embroidery come to them in visions while they are dreaming. So they also think about the world as not being divided between being awake and being asleep. It is not linear again. The existence in this realm, it's the in-between. Now, this sounds all very magical, but it also has something that is very much scientific and practical. Remember I told you that Lucia Sumaeta happens to be a midwife. Her dream actually was to become a medical doctor with a specialty in obstetrics because she believed that that was the best way she could serve her community. She saw a lot of infant and baby mortality rate when women were trying to nurse their children. How is this connected to climate change? Because of pollution and because of man-made climate crisis, she saw a lot of children who did not thrive and died shortly after being born. So one of her dreams actually belongs to this world, to keep these children alive. And it is also some sort of fight and her own personal resistance against extinction. Because one of the reasons her community is getting smaller is the high mortality rate. Now, I remember that some of you was mentioning the potatoes. And now potatoes are of this world, but are also very magical. Let me introduce to you the International Potato Center. You can see even on the logo a little creature, right? So that creature is actually a representation of one of the smaller deities. In one hand has the potatoes, and in the other hand, it's holding the branches of the tuber. So it is a very powerful representation of what we are capable of. And the potato, as old as it is actually a marvel in technology, because the potato was pretty much a root or a tuber until the people of what is now called Peru, pre-Columbian times, were able to domesticate this tuber and literally feed the world. Now, that was something about the past, and this is very futuristic now. The potato is planning to go to space. We haven't gone to space, but the potato will. There are plans to send some little plants, and these tubers are being experimented on in order to prepare them to tolerate similar conditions to space. So we might be able to plant them outside this world. Another way in which the past makes way for the future is the Space Exploration Institute. Now, this is in Switzerland. In 2019, there was a call for a new art initiative. How can the potato be artistic? Well, a professor in arts decided to think of something subversive. The potato, the art, and democracy. Because there is nothing more humble than the potato. When you think about potatoes, you usually think about these powerful people, usually men, in these shiny suits, right? But the potato is so old, right? And it has so many varieties that Professor Lucia Monge decided to collaborate with an engineer, Xin Liu, to decolonize the narrative of the future. That space exploration is not just for those fortunate people that might be able to buy a ticket out of this crisis one day. The potato can fit everybody and anybody, and so the potato should be the first to be in space. Now, she recalls how her forefathers talked about dreams, reality, and fantasy. And then we're going back to the world of dreams, how we are able to build our future based on our past. Because that is really what the indigenous knowledge is. For the longest time, a lot of people weren't really aware of what the indigenous was. They just were indigenous. They were not really practicing ancestral ways. They were just our ways. People performed their rituals for, say, their farewells when somebody died, carrying coffins and dancing with them, thinking about death not being the ultimate frontier, but just a cycle, like time. Because life is not linear, it's cyclical. And that is also something that it's informed by the world of nature. It is important that many of you have mentioned the word emotion today, because science is usually thought about as something really clean, like a laboratory, completely abstract sometimes. But science is very passionate, and the indigenous is science. It looks like it's old science, but as we discussed before, it is the way of the future. The word indigenous itself serves a purpose to make it visible, push public policy, to give the indigenous holders an edge to succeed in their endeavors. But we also have to be careful, because that word can become a label that can re-victimize and stigmatize, and pushed to the confines of the reservations and left to collect dust because it's history and it should belong to a museum. but it doesn't. It's the indigenous is alive. The indigenous communities preserve the old ways, um, even though they're smaller in number. They are not the only voices that are heard. Their voices, as many of you have observed today, might be in different languages, but they are important voices to hear. And there are many other people that want to magnify those voices because the indigenous has these practices, these rituals, are voices to the past, from the past, that will magnified in whispers. Those voices are everywhere as whispers in our heads, sometimes in a language that we might not think is ours, sometimes in a language that we thought was Spanish, but those voices are not foreign, they are ours. The foreign implies that they belong in the elsewhere, and they don't. They belong with us. They are alive, like a person, as rivers have been granted personhood. Those voices are here, they are legions, and so we are, the people of indigenous descent. And we speak in 1,000 tongues. Some of those are tongues of indigenous forefathers, some of those are European tongues, but we want to communicate and we want to get to know people because we want to one day get to the cycle of time where indigenous knowledge is just knowledge. And there might come a day when we are able to call it just that. And in the meantime, we'll take the label and sail with the whispers in our dreams. Thank you.
Gabriela, I think Noelia will translate here. Could you briefly explain your work to us and also say how you integrate indigenous and local knowledge to your work?
Gabriela, ¿podrías explicarnos el tipo de trabajo que realizas y cómo integras el conocimiento indígena dentro de tu trabajo?
Eh, Buenas tardes, ¿sí? Buenas tardes. Eh, yo tengo la oportunidad de haber trabajado en el sector salud. Actualmente soy ingeniero sanitario, hidrosanitario o, ¿cómo podemos decirlo? Que me dedico a todo lo que es relacionado al agua. Pero decir que conozco todo sobre el agua es, es demasiado ambicioso. Así que me, en la universidad me enseñaron diferentes ramas para tratar el agua, conservar el agua, educación sanitaria, pero yo me enfoqué en la rama de hospitalaria, obviamente para proporcionar agua a los hospitales.
Ujú. Gabriela is a sanitary engineer and her work focuses mostly on water and hospitals.
Wonderful. So Gabriela, you mentioned earlier that you work in very rural communities. Can you say in which communities you work and how you access the local and indigenous knowledge that then informs your projects?
Ok. Mm, eh, Mi trabajo me ha llevado a diferentes lugares del país, de Perú, obviamente. He trabajado, esto es el Perú, ¿no? He trabajado en Lima, pero Lima tiene también provincias o pueblos alejados a la urbanización o a la capital. He trabajado en, bueno, en este aquí sería en una parte de la sierra, en la selva, al norte, y también he trabajado en zonas más alejadas donde es la misma selva.
She has worked in Lima, she has worked in highlands and in the jungle, but she also makes the observation that within Lima, even though it's the capital city, there are smaller towns where her work is also important.
Ok. Mi trabajo me ha llevado a lugares como la selva. En este caso viene a ser Centro de Salud Nuevo Andoas. Nueva Andoas queda en un lugar muy lejano de difícil acceso.
Her work has taken her to places in the jungle, such as this. It's not really a hospital. A centro de salud is a smaller unit than a hospital with restricted services. And this is called Nueva Andoas. And this is one of the projects she has worked on.
Ok. En este caso, quería mostrar que es una conversación con los jefes de la comunidad. En este caso tenemos al jefe chivivo indígena, bueno, de la selva, y al alcalde, que viene a ser representante del gobierno. Sin embargo, sin embargo, cuando tienes una reunión con ellos, los acuerdos se firman con el APU. El APU es el que realmente te da el acceso a su comunidad.
Right. So in here, she's showing a video in which a conversation is taking place. There is a meeting between the chieftains of this area. You can see them with their garments in here. This gentleman is a chieftain of the Shipibo in the jungle. He is in a meeting with the mayor to talk about the development of these smaller hospitals in the area. This is not just a political meeting, it is also a meeting to ask for permission from the APU, which is a higher order of representative in the jungle.
Durante estas reuniones yo me di cuenta de que l- los, los APUs eh, te indican, te indican, no necesito un proceso burocrático, necesito que me digas si mi centro de salud, mi centro de atención a mi poblador va a funcionar, va a llegar, cuándo. Las personas que se encuentran en el gobierno, por lo menos en Perú, tratamos de cuidarnos con el trámite documentario, porque si existe algún documento que falta, simplemente el culpable es el funcionario. Entonces, existen muchas trabas burocráticas que a los apus o las personas de ese pueblo que vienen a estar en un lugar muy alejado, digamos que no les importa demasiado, les interesa que su hospital esté creado.
The APU's priority is to deliver a service. So they are interested in the timing and how it will, how these services, these health services will be delivered. There is sometimes a bit of tension in the negotiations with the APUs because of bureaucracy. We're talking about towns in the jungle that are very isolated. So timing, bureaucracy, and sometimes miscommunication can be huge hurdles in this type of processes.
Cuando un apu se acerca a una entrevista o a una entrevista con las autoridades, lo primero que te dicen es, mi familia tiene plomo, tiene, tiene tumores, tiene muchas enfermedades provocadas por la contaminación que genera petróleo y otros tipos de contaminación. Y esa fue la primera impresión de mi de los primeros años que tuve como un APU con todo el dolor de tener enfermos o personas que ya murieron provocadas por la contaminación, puede seguir adelante a cuidar a su comunidad. En ese momento entendí que la construcción de un hospital no solo tiene que ver con la ingeniería, con eh, la parte de la matemática, el diseño, ¿no? La parte intelectual. Tiene que ver con un compromiso dentro de uno mismo. O sea, tener empatía por la persona a la que vas a ayudar o en todo caso a la que vas a tener que construirle un centro de salud.
She talked about the human aspect outside of the technical work she has done as an engineer. She has told us about some of the first projects she worked on, and her experience in the jungle was that these apus, these representatives, are usually come with issues that have affected their community and their lives personally. One of the chieftains in one of the projects she worked when she first started working as an engineer was a chieftain that came with tales of tumors, illnesses caused by pollution and fossil fuels in the area. And even though he could have asked for personal help, he put his community first. And so Gabriela realized that service to oneself, service to others, and service to the community shouldn't be divorced from each other.
Mientras Noelia hablaba, estaba mostrando un video donde se ve el río Amazonas nuevamente contaminado. Eh, Solamente necesitas escribir en Google o en cualquier servidor y poner Amazonas contaminado y los videos que salen o las noticias que salen no son de un año a otro, son prácticamente de acá a 3 meses, un mes y muchos de ellos a veces no se reportan. Eso es lo que quería expresar, que un comunero de estas comunidades nativas tienen que luchar todos los días y muchos de ellos son asesinados por defender su espacio, ¿no? No sé si se ve otra imagen.
Yeah. So you have seen the video where Gabriela shows the pollution of the Amazon River. Apart from the illnesses that this causes, she also talks about how frequent these problems are. There are reports that come about every so often. Every year, you can find them quite often. And you can also see how much death these man-made disasters are brought by inequality and also by neglect. She just showed us a still of news of activists of indigenous communities that are killed when they raise their voices.
Nueva Andoas es el hospital que el APU fue a pedir este apoyo para su hospital, para que se construya el hospital. Pero Nueva Andoas está aquí. Lima está aquí, en esta parte. No sé cómo se hace. Lima está en este espacio, pero Nueva Andoas está por acá. Entonces, muchos de nosotros tenemos la oportunidad de viajar en un avión, en un tren. Bueno, en Perú no hay tren, pero en en un bus, en un carro, y podemos llegar. Llega hasta cierto punto que yo puedo llegar en avión hasta esta parte. Luego tengo que tomar un bus. Y luego, ¿qué pasa? Uy,
Okay. So Gabriela was showing us on a map a representation of how far away the hospital Nuevo Andoas is. The hospital is in the jungle, and all the power and bureaucracy is centralized in the capital city, Lima. You can get from Lima to the area where Nuevo Andoas is using transportation up to a certain point, but doing the trip the other way around, it's a bit more difficult.
Entonces, si yo me acerco a la foto, al, al Google, ahí vemos que existe ríos, sigue habiendo ríos. Entonces, cuando llegamos al punto de ya no podemos tomar bus, no podemos tomar autos, tenemos que ir en bote. En bote te demoras 5 días, descansas en otra comunidad indígena y te demoras otros 5 días, solamente para revisar o para evaluar cómo está el hospital. Son 15 días más o menos que te toma llegar.
It takes around 15 days to go from Lima to Nuevo Andoas. The problem is that from Lima, you have a vast array of transportation. You can take a plane, then you can take a bus, then you can take a car, maybe a horse, but there is one point where no human nor beast can make the trip, and you have to take a boat. You have to travel by boat, and you have to navigate the river, but you cannot make the trip in one go. So you have to stay in a community and jump from place to place until you make it to Nuevo Andoas.
Entonces, muchas personas o muchos ingenieros o profesionales, en primer lugar, no se animan a llegar a este espacio, hasta Nueva Andoas, también hay Nuevo Jerusalén. O sea, hay diferentes centros de salud que para nosotros parece muy cercano, pero te toman 3 a 4 días solo para ir de un pueblo a otro.
Due to how isolated these places are and how difficult it is to get transportation to these places, there are engineers who just plain and simply refuse their service because they either can't make it or won't make it there. And this is only one example. There are many other small health centers that are not serviced because of it.
¿Ok? Entonces, el gobierno a veces no te da el presupuesto para poder ir, o sea, no ir todas las especialidades. Hay arquitectos, ingenieros civiles, ingenieros estructurales y nosotros, ingenieros de agua. ¿Qué es lo que hacemos? Enseñamos a otro profesional, que puede ser un arquitecto o un economista, que son los que evalúan los eh, riesgos económicos o la vulnerabilidad del proyecto para evaluar si es viable o no invertir en el proyecto. Suena frío, pero los primeros que van son los economistas, porque tienen que evaluar el dinero.
So, since we already know that not every single engineer, technician, or professional will be able or plainly won't want to go there, they pick somebody who is willing and they train them in pretty much an engineer in everything, so they can do the preliminary studies. Of course, before the technicians go, the first person to go is an economist. And that makes for a very cruel recipe.
¿Ok? Entonces, por ejemplo, acá hay otro pueblo que está también cerca al río del Marañón, del Date del Marañón, al lugar donde les mostré en el mapa. y es un establecimiento, se llama Alianza Cristiana. Hay otro que se llama Jerusalén, Nueva Jerusalén, y muchos de ellos no cuentan con agua ni desagüe. Ustedes saben que el hospital, para que funcione, tiene ingeniería biomédica, que son los que colocan los equipos biomédicos, eh, arquitectura, que es el que va a diseñar los ambientes, doctores, los que van a indicar, pero doctores que se especializan en saber qué tipos de ambientes o consultorios debe tener.
So we have seen in here another health center where there is not enough manpower to make everything work properly. So you have a list of professionals that you need to make a health center work. Amongst them, an architect, doctors, but not really doctors to give a consultation as a general practitioner, but a doctor who can somewhat calculate the needs of the community and provide services that are financially that make financial sense for the government to invest on. It sounds very cruel, but they cannot simply build a hospital for every single need. So they have to pick.
That is often the conflict between what the indigenous or the local people need and what makes financial sense. Have you ever implemented a project that was maybe more affordable because it integrated some local or indigenous knowledge on water management?
Mm. ¿Alguna vez has implementado algún proyecto en el que el conocimiento indígena en el manejo del agua haya hecho que el proyecto mismo haya sido más barato, haya sido más fiscalmente ventajoso?
Eh, sí, hemos implementado paneles solares. Justamente el problema quería llegar a ese punto, el problema de que no tengamos acceso al agua potable como en una ciudad o la energía eléctrica, te obliga a usar energías renovables. Pero, eh, ¿cómo sabes dónde existen puntos de agua, ojos de agua? En este caso, esto es en la selva, ¿no? Pero en el caso de la sierra, sí, sí tenemos, sí tenemos lugares. Por ejemplo, este proyecto es de Cajamarca. Y como estos proyectos eh, conviven, conviven con con los centros con la naturaleza y la urbanización, en este caso un centro de salud, tenemos que sacar datos de primera mano o rápidos para poder actuar en el proyecto.
Yes, there are projects in which you can take advantage of the environment uh, for the betterment of your project. Of course, you have solar panels, but there are areas in the highlands where you can use water power to give energy to the installations that you're using. And in order to identify where this water comes from, you need to consult with the local communities, which are indigenous communities and holders of this knowledge.
Por ejemplo, ellos nos indican el ojo de agua o el manantial. Nos cuentan muchas historias acerca de su vida, de sus papás, su abuelito, pero dentro de la historia, en una cena, en una costumbre de compartir cosas, el ingeniero tiene que ir a escuchar las historias, pero dentro de esas historias sacamos mucha información. Por ejemplo, de qué mes a qué mes el manantial empieza a tener bastante producción de agua o cuándo se seca. Entonces, sí,
Um, so at this point, in order to gather data and information from where to get your water to power these installations, is when it comes the indigenous people as holders of this knowledge. There is technical work from the engineers that becomes really pretty much socializing with the local people. They have to gather with the community, and they need to listen to the stories of when the elders talk about the water beds origins. Sometimes there are very old stories in which you can gather data of when the waters dried and when they grow.
¿por qué tenemos que conversar con las personas que han vivido muchos años ahí, que generalmente son personas ancianas? Es porque la data del gobierno muchas veces es incompleta o no existe. Este gráfico parece elaborado y sacado de algún documento eh, de registro hídrico. Sin embargo, es netamente hablado por los mismos, las mismas personas que viven ahí. Y es así como nosotros podemos tener una idea de cómo es el recorrido del agua.
So why is it necessary to use oral history to inform the technicians? Because the neglect from the government has left them without records. So the graphic you see here, it's actually a representation of oral history gathered by the engineers talking to the local community. This wasn't the metrics, this wasn't statistics, this is purely made by oral story, a reconstruction that is pretty accurate.
Entonces, por qué tuvimos que hacer esta identificación de áreas donde hay agua o por dónde es el recorrido del agua cuando existe grandes cantidades de lluvia? Porque a un ingeniero o a un arquitecto se le ocurrió revisar el- la data histórica del gobierno, ¿no? Donde tenemos datos de por dónde pasa el agua. Sin embargo, el, el arquitecto eh, confió en esa data y diseñó de una forma que eh, invadía o interrumpía la ruta normal de su, del curso del agua, ¿no? Por eso es importante tener, tener, tener la data de la gente que vive ahí y preguntar cómo es que se maneja el río, ¿no?
So it is very important to gather this data from the elders because the oral history turned out to be far more accurate than the blueprints. Here she's showing blueprints for something that was built that invaded the natural path of the river. As a result, of course, this would bring about destruction. But if they had done the work with oral history before, this could have been prevented. This is just another way in which indigenous knowledge holders should have been taken into account to prevent disaster.
Entonces, como ingeniero sanitario, como ingeniero del agua, nosotros instalamos tuberías de agua, instalamos tuberías de desagüe, pero cada proyecto es muy particular, porque como se ve, este proyecto, sin la información de una persona ancestral, digámoslo ancestral porque tiene bastantes años, más de 90, nos ayuda a que el hospital o el centro de salud, en este caso, sea amigable con el ambiente. Entonces, nosotros en nuestros planos hacemos como un pequeño pase para que el agua siga su trayectoria normal y tanto el hospital, o el centro de salud y el ambiente convivan.
Water installation. She calls herself, even though she's a sanitation engineer, she calls herself a water engineer. So water installation has to be done taking into account the natural environment. You cannot defy the river. You have to build a hospital in harmony with the river to ensure that the infrastructure outlasts several changes around.
Otra cosa que vimos es que, por aquí me olvidé, ok, por aquí hay galerías de agua que tampoco tuvieron, o sea, toda la información que podemos tener de primera mano de las personas que viven en el lugar es muy importante porque nos ayudan a acelerar los procesos. Porque sí es cierto, existen estudios hidrológicos y un montón de estudios que pueden ayudarnos a aclarar cómo diseñar, ¿no? Pero el gobierno te pide acciones rápidas y tú tienes que manejar la información como ingeniero de forma rápida. No les interesa si tienes el tiempo para hacer todos los estudios.
Mhm. The government usually asks for speed, and sometimes it is thought that being in commune with the elders might slow down things. But Gabriela argues this quite the contrary, that there is not enough amount of science or hydrological studies that can speed this process up than to informing yourself with the local knowledge holders. Because just by being in commune with the locals, you already gather so much information that can speed up the process.
That is a wonderful, wonderful comment. Gabriela, in the interest of time, I think I might need to stop here, but I wanted to ask, is there one more thing you wanted to say, or you feel you have said everything? Because I know I shared some of the questions or also in advance, so you nicely weaved so much information in here, and thank you so much for your work. This is very, very impressive. But please ask your sister.
¿Hay alguna última cosa que te gustaría mencionar?
Sí, no todo es malo en el gobierno, porque la aceleración de los trámites hacen que piensen que, bueno, tenemos que recurrir siempre a las personas del lugar. Yo sé que existen geólogos, hidrólogos especializados, pero la toma de decisiones son muy rápidas y para eso nos ayudan las personas que viven en ese lugar. Lo bueno es que el gobierno también llega a tu casita, en este caso a la selva. Entonces, existen barquitos donde eh, encuentras trámites administrativos, como tu registro de banco, un pequeño hospital o un pequeño centro de salud dentro de un barquito, a sacar tu partida de nacimiento. Entonces, no todo es malo. Tratamos de ver lo bueno y en este caso ha sido la, un profesional, y me imagino que debe haber sido un profesional de la selva que piensa cómo llegamos a lugares tan recónditos.
Right. So even though she has talked about some projects that were designed by the government with quite a critical eye, She also says that not everything is bad about the government. They have brilliant ways to live with harmony with these communities. One of these examples are these boats that navigate the rivers to bring public service to other people, such as banking, also identification, registration services, things that could not be made if the people from these communities had to travel to centralized cities. She also talks about how important it is to include this service and how it serves the people of indigenous descent. And she has mentioned this very briefly, the name servidor público, and it's also in the slides. That means a public servant, which is the old word for government official. And she's very positive about that old term, because a public servant has as their own job to serve the public.
Thank you. Thank you very much.